Okay. Callie, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay,
I
good.
believe everyone else can.
Okay, good. Just making sure because I'm calling in on my phone. My computer doesn't have a mic, so sometimes I have issues. So I'm glad you can hear me. Like Callie said, my name's Colleen Kane. I work in the Civic Engagement Office. I've been here just over 10 years, and I've been doing CBI for several of those. So it's super fun. We try to change it up each time we get more technology uses so we can have more interactions. So every time it's a little bit more exciting. Yeah. Anything else I should add before we get started, Callie?
Maybe we should mention the breakout rooms right now in the beginning. Everyone should have received an email from me yesterday describing what breakout rooms are. They're kind of like mini meetings. So later on in Colleen's session, we're going to break everyone out into these breakout rooms. And those 2 questions that I sent you in those emails to tie back to the TED Talk, everyone will be discussing those within their mini meetings, and if you could, please, once you get into those breakout rooms, assign kind of like a note taker or a lead on it, so when we all reconvene, that person from your breakout room will describe what you talked about.
And I can give a little bit of a refresher right before we head out into the breakout rooms in case we forget. Perfect. So we've got 18 participants. That seems like a good number, and we're about 2 minutes after, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. And if folks join us late, they won't be too lost, and we'll have this PowerPoint for you guys later because there's some good resources at the end. So welcome to Community Assessment. I hope you were able to take a peek at that TED Talk that I sent. That TED Talk was more focused on asset-based community development, which is a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but they're very complementary. So I wanted you to have kind of a taste of these different types of tools. The asset-based community development can be encompassed within this kind of community assessment model we're going to be talking about today. So I'm hoping these go together pretty well, even though they're slightly different. So hopefully that makes sense as we get started. And feel free to ask questions along the way if they come up. I'll be trying to watch for hands or the chat box as we go. And if I miss them, I'm sure Callie will get them. So what we're going to be talking about today are the 6 steps to doing high-quality community assessment. We're going to be talking about what issues to focus on and how to narrow the scope of your assessment, who to involve, whether you want to do this on your own or whether you want to partner with other organizations or entities, what questions to ask, what types of questions to focus on, how to collect data, and what to do once you've collected the data and how to share it. And then I have some resources at the end to share as well. So first of all, what's the point of doing community assessment? Why do it? It's always, always, always better to understand a problem as fully as you can before you jump in and try to fix things. So community assessment helps us better understand the needs of the community, the assets that are available, and the issues that are arising around those assets and those challenges. It also helps us identify gaps in services. So it just gives us a bigger, broader, better, more clear picture of our community needs, what assets are available, what gaps are there, and how to address those needs. It also helps to build stronger communities because a community assessment will give community members an opportunity to share their needs, their perspectives, their lived experiences, and how the needs of the community the needs that you're focusing on impact the quality of life for the larger community. So within that process, it increases your credibility as a service provider because you've done this assessment and you've built those relationships, and it increases the credibility of your study and the credibility of whatever programming, intervention, whatever comes out of this assessment because you've done this process and you've invited the community in and they now have some kind of buy-in with this process because you've involved them. It also helps honor people and their experiences by going through this process and giving people a voice, letting them share their experience, letting them communicate their challenges and their needs. So community engagement in this process is just naturally increased because members from different parts of the community are included in the discussions about needs, assets, and the community's general response. So creating that buy-in and ownership is super helpful when you try to do any type of programming or when you're working to partner on any kind of a project or initiative. It also helps prevent ineffectiveness. Community strengths and weaknesses are identified. You can find gaps in services. the process that you go through will create naturally kind of an inventory of resources that are currently available within the community that can then be leveraged to help you with your program or help you with your initiative, whatever you're working on, and help improve the quality of life for those community members. It will help communities identify, like I said, those asset gaps that exist, what kind of services are being provided and what maybe are not being provided, and what are the gaps in services that exist there. It also helps prevent a duplication of services. You might think that there's a big community need out there, and then you start going through this process and you might find out that there are other organizations addressing this need. Maybe they're not addressing it well, or maybe they are, but it helps prevent duplication of services so that you can potentially partner with others rather than starting something new and competing with them. And that's super important when we're working with our communities to make sure we're not duplicating services that others are trying to do. And it helps us better utilize the resources that we have available to us in our communities. Oh, and if there are AmeriCorps members on the call, this last one you should be very familiar with, these words, sustainability and capacity building. It helps improve these as well. So community organizations can use this information that you're collecting about community needs to assess their own service delivery priorities. It will also help you provide or create and provide data for making decisions. Data-driven decision-making is always the best way to go whenever possible. So it can help you kind of use this data for making good, wholesome, positive decisions to address community needs and how to use the available assets that you have. The data that you collect can also be used to inform like strategic planning, priority setting, program outcomes, and program improvements. So this data can be used for lots of different things once you've collected it that will help with sustainability and capacity building. So the 6 steps we're going to talk about today include defining the scope of your assessment, talking about the pros and cons to doing this yourself or collaborating with other entities, steps to collect the data, steps to ID key findings, how to set priorities and action steps, and then how to share your findings. And we just have an hour today, so we're just going to kind of gloss through these steps pretty quickly, but the resources I'm going to share at the end go into these steps in detail. So this will kind of give you a flavor of this process, and then if you're going to do it and you want to pursue this, I have some resources to share that will go into these steps in a little bit more detail. So the first step is defining the scope of your assessment. When starting to define the scope of your community assessment, you should first determine the specific needs you want to address. What issues are you looking at? And this may seem easy, but when you pick an issue, it automatically it connects to lots of other issues. One community issue does not sit in isolation, so it can be hard when you start to address a need. You start to see how connected all these other needs are. And so choosing a focus within that need can help you develop a clear path to a successful assessment. So I'm going to show this quick video that just shows the interconnectedness of these issues. And there's no sound on here, so if you're not hearing anything, that is good. Great, so that video just kind of illustrates the interconnectedness of community issues, and if you wanted to look at preventing gang involvement, all the different things that might be involved with that. So when you're kind of narrowing down the scope of the community issue you want to address, just kind of be aware that these other connected issues will inevitably arise, and you may have to make choices on whether you want to address several of these related issues or kind of narrow down the scope and focus on one specific slice of those connected issues. And you may not even, once you get into your assessment, your path may may shift as you find priorities kind of leading towards one direction, and that's okay too. So flexibility is also a good thing to have once you start getting in there and seeing what needs are popping up. You'll also want to take a look at who are the community members that are most impacted by the issue you're looking at, do the geographic boundaries of your assessment, and then key questions you're going to focus on. And you're going to want to narrow down these key questions so they're not so broad and overwhelming, because you're going to start to get a lot of information if your questions are super broad. I'm just going to kind of read through a list of some key questions that you may want answered that might serve as good examples, and they might spark some curiosity or give you some ideas of how to get started. So you might want to look at the basic demographics of your community, looking at income levels, number of youth, things like that. You might want to take a look at the faith-based and community organizations who are serving people in your community. What services are they providing and to whom, and are they doing it well? What services are local public agencies providing and to whom? Maybe you want to look at law enforcement, probation, court, schools, workforce development, those types of things. What organizations are funded by foundations and government agencies to address the community issue that you're looking at? What do the local residents see as the primary need for this community? And is it the issue you want to focus at, or is it not? What are the various intervention strategies being used in the community to address the issue you're looking at? And are those practices that are already in place, are they generating kind of clear outcomes or not? Who are the leaders in your community, and what key players in local government are concerned with the issues you want to address? Are there allies you can establish in that area? What are local volunteer groups doing to serve that issue, or are they not addressing it at all? Who are the people in the community who care about the issue or who are being impacted by the issue? What community organizations are focusing on this issue, and are they delivering services in a meaningful way? Are there partnering opportunities with other nonprofits or faith-based organizations that you can establish? And then what are gaps in services to people in your community that are impacted by the issue? You might want to take a look at what would a complete system look like, and are the community members who are impacted by this issue, are they ready for change, or is this going to be an uphill battle? So try to think of that kind of readiness for change factor. So those are just some ideas of some key questions you might want to take a look at. But again, you want to limit it to a few of these and narrow down the scope as much as possible, because as soon as you get started, you're going to see how a lot of these different issues are interconnected and are going to get kind of complex as you get into them. So the next thing you're going to want to look at is, do you want to do this assessment alone, or do you want to team up with other organizations or entities? So there are benefits to collaboration, always benefits, and there are also challenges. Benefits to collaboration include you will have more resources to do this assessment for the most part. So you'll want to consider the level of resources that you currently have available. You'll take a look at the time and effort you have available to do this work, any human resources that are available through your current organization or through others who you might partner with, through stakeholders. You may want to look at staff, volunteers, consultants, board members you have available to you to do this work. Establishing good collaborations will help increase the resources you have available to you and may help you do kind of a higher quality, more full assessment. But at the same time, whenever you invite others into your process, you kind of are at the mercy of their needs in addition to your needs. So you want to make sure that any partnership you establish, that you're all on the same page, and that the issue that you're looking at is clear, so that when you get into it, you're not kind of wandering off, kind of a mission creep kind of a thing where you're wandering off into different directions based on their needs and your needs not lining up well. So to avoid that, I always suggest that that folks use like a memorandum of understanding of sorts. It doesn't have to be a formal document, it can be, but something in writing that establishes the goal of the project and makes sure that everybody is on the same page, and it will help keep things clean and transparent, so that if you get into this assessment and it starts to take you in wonky directions, you can stay true to that original goal and have that in writing, so that you can always return back to that, so that you stay on a clear and practical path. But collaboration can be really wonderful. It can increase the community members or the constituents that you have access to, and it can increase the data sources that you can access to answer those key questions. Again, more resources may be available to help cover expenses. It will also help establish relationships with maybe stakeholders that will be important for the implementation phase. So creating that buy-in early could be really beneficial. So just kind of weigh the pros and cons with doing this alone or branching out, and then make sure if you do collaborate that you have some kind of agreement in place where the goals are really clearly outlined along with who's doing what and your target for this assessment, so that it's clean and clear. And those are just some ideas on that slide of who to maybe reach out to collaborate with. So step 3 is the fun part, I think, is the collecting the data part. So you're going to begin any data collection effort with secondary sources. So your community assessment will be based on these 2 types of data, secondary sources and primary sources. Start with the secondary sources, and this is data that has already been collected by others. If you're a researcher, this would kind of be similar to your lit review. So you're going to look at what has already been collected, what do we already know. You don't want to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. Try to figure out what information is already out there that you can absorb and collect. And you might find that this gives you all the information that you need, and you might be really good with that, or you might identify gaps in that information and then move on with your community assessment. So always start with those secondary sources, the data that has already been collected by others whenever possible. Because other members in the community may have already kind of done this work and collected the information that you're looking for. So once you've collected those secondary sources and you've kind of identified what information you have available to you and what you need to still collect, you'll move to your primary data collection methods. And you'll want to start with kind of local sources of information and broaden from there as needed. This will help keep your assessment focused. And if you broaden as needed, it will make sure you're not overwhelmed by unnecessary information. And you're going to want to focus on the quality of the data you're collecting rather than the quantity, and make sure that you're not collecting a whole bunch of data that's not relevant to the information you're actually looking for. So broad, tons of data, it sounds really wonderful, but you're going to have to sift through that and make it relevant to what you're actually looking for. So try to focus on quality over quantity whenever possible when doing your primary data collection methods. Challenges you'll want to think about before getting started is your staff capacity and money that you have available to do the study, the stakeholders that you want to include and who they are and how many, whether or not you're going to be able to use volunteers to help you with this, and what kind of resources it's going to take to do this work. And as we talk about the different models, you might get some ideas, but you might want to start thinking about whether or not you're going to need kind of food at the focus groups or events, whether your participants are going to need childcare or other types of vouchers, transportation issues. Are you going to have to offer a stipend or some type of incentive for participation? Are you going to need to find raffle prizes for surveys coming in? So kind of brainstorm think about the resources you're going to need before you get too deep into this, and make sure that your decided method is viable. Hope that makes sense. So now we're going to talk about different types of data collection methods. And some of these are similar with just kind of nuanced differences, but just gives you an idea of the different methods that are out there, starting with structured conversations with existing stakeholders. And these could be individual interviews or kind of group conversations, public forums or town hall meetings, listening sessions or focus groups, and then surveys, whether they're electronic, email, hard copy, snail mail type surveys, or telephone polls, which we don't do a ton of anymore, but they're still definitely a viable option depending on your demographics. And I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail so you can get kind of the flavor of each one. So starting with structured conversations or interviews with existing stakeholders, often a SWOT analysis model is used where you kind of base your main questions on the SWOT analysis, so that if you're not familiar, it's just looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats towards an organization or an issue that you're working on. And then some questions based on that are below. Structured conversations and interviews take time and resources to do, especially if you're doing individual interviews, but you can get some really, really rich data from this process, especially if you're using really targeted recruitment for those interviews or those conversations. But also structured conversations, if you're doing them in groups, can be a little bit more resource friendly because you get more than one person in at a time. So you might want to think about whether interviews or group conversations would be best, and what that would look like. Individual interviews, like I said, can get really rich data, especially if you're working with like vulnerable populations where a group setting might not be so appropriate, but they can take time. They may take more than an hour each. Doing them one at a time can be daunting, just depending on the type of information you're hoping to collect. You can think about which of those methods might be more feasible. It's also important to consider your demographic when planning these sorts of things to help determine the time of day you might want to hold these, whether childcare needs are going to be an issue, transportation barriers to participation, things like that, and think about whether individual versus group participation might be more appropriate. These conversations or interviews are going to be really looking at targeted individuals versus like inviting the general population to participate. So it's really intentional, specific invitations towards people that have the information that you need to collect, not the general public. Versus public forums or town hall meetings, which are kind of more open to the general public when you're trying to just get like a swath of information from general people and not specific information from targeted groups. So a town hall meeting gives the public a space to speak their minds, to talk about the issues at hand, and hopefully find some solutions or ideas to some of the problems you're looking to address. They're less structured than the structured conversations or the interviews. And they're more generally open to those who are interested in the topic and want to come talk about it. So with this option, advertising is going to be really important because you want to get, with these kinds of forums, you're looking for kind of a breadth of information and feedback. So larger participation is going to be more helpful than maybe say in the structured conversations where you're looking at a really targeted group. These are more open to the public. So advertising is going to be your biggest challenge to make sure that you're getting enough people in the room and enough of the people in the room that you want to hear from to make it worthwhile. And so with advertising, it can be overwhelming, but informing the public of the dates and times is helpful. You can do this through lots of different methods, through your newsletter channels, through your membership, through public papers or flyers. There are also some targeted communities that might be able to help get that information out. And things like that. So there are kind of targeted ways you can get the information out about this public forum to make sure that you get a good turnout. And then setting and following a schedule is really important with these conversations because with people, so many people in the room that may have different priorities or different reasons for being there, it can take you in wild directions. So making sure that you've got an agenda in place and that you've got somebody that's making sure that the conversation is moving forward in a helpful way and not just going all over the place is going to be important. So you're going to want, for this kind of an event, you're going to want a facilitator who's going to be that person that's moderating that conversation, and then somebody who's either taking notes or recording so that the person who's facilitating doesn't also have to remember all the important gems, because it's hard to do that at the same time. And then the facilitator or the moderator will keep the meeting running smoothly, recognize who's talking, making sure that people aren't talking over each other, and also making sure that they're not going off in wild directions. You can create a parking lot to put things that are kind of outside the scope of what you want to look at. And then, yeah, like I said, make sure somebody who's not the facilitator is taking notes because it's so hard to do both of those at the same time. So that's public forums and town hall meetings, which are a little different from listening sessions or focus groups, which are less for the public and more for a really specific targeted group of people. Focus groups are really similar to those structured conversations or group interviews, but they are even more structured and more focused. So you're going to invite really specific people to be in this focus group or listening session. You want really specific information from them. These are carefully planned series of discussions to obtain perceptions or information around a really defined area of interest. But these should be really kind of open and non-threatening and permissive environments so that people feel comfortable sharing. Even though they're less focused in the town hall meetings or the structured interviews, they're more focused in the town halls or the structured interviews, so they're going to be conversational yet structured questions, if that makes sense. And they're usually held in small groups of really like demographic people, so you're going to really craft this pool of people carefully to make sure that because these are folks that have really specific information that you want to get at when you do this type of an activity. So you get really rich data, fun data. It can be therapeutic for participants to come and talk about the issue in a safe, confined, kind of safe environment. You can work with partners to help recruit the population that you're interested in. And this is where collaboration can be really key. If you're working collaboratively with other organizations, they're going to have maybe a line on helping to recruit some of these really targeted people you want to talk to. You can use newsletters or listservs to help recruit. But it's really important when you're recruiting for this type of an event to tell the folks why you need their help, why their participation is really important to you, and then be respectful of their time and mindful of any barriers they might have to participation. But I've been asked to participate in several of these types of events, and when they can communicate to me why my personal experience is really important for them to hear, then I feel so much more valued in that process and I want to come and help, versus maybe like the town hall thing where it's just like, yep, come if you're interested in this topic kind of a thing. These focus groups should be more individualized, and it really helps if you kind of really explain why their expertise or their help or their knowledge about a subject or their lived experience is really valuable to this process. So that is a focus group in the listening session. The one we're probably all the most familiar with is the use of surveys. Because they're easy, you can hit a wide variety of people with a survey, you can reach a broader audience. They take less time and less resources than any of these other types of assessments, but there are some challenges with using surveys too. So some concerns I have with using surveys include like the response rate. Often you send surveys out and you get like a 20% response rate, so is that really helpful or not? There's no accountability when responding to surveys. They're usually anonymous. People can say whatever they want. You don't know the kind of the context that they're filling this out in. So there's really no kind of accountability for the folks that are filling out the survey. And then they always have the option to not answer certain questions or to not answer it in the way that you've asked them to answer it. So there's just, you have lack of control in the way that they respond to this, and you can't follow up with clarifiers if they've said something that's confusing. So surveys are great in that you can hit a large variety of people, broader audience, less resources, but there are some limitations to the information you get back with surveys. If you do decide to do surveys, you should think about the types of questions you're going to ask. It's really important that you aren't asking impartial or leading questions, that you're not asking partial or leading questions. You want to stay impartial and non-leading. Like you wouldn't want to ask a question like, how much do you love volunteering? I mean, I think I could ask that question, but that's making an assumption that they do love volunteering. So just kind of look at the language of the questions and how you're wording things to make sure that you're staying really neutral and you're not making assumptions within those questions. And then also think about the pros and cons to using open-ended kind of qualitative questions. You can get more complete responses often and some richer data, but it's also harder to process that and harder to analyze, and it's harder to be objective with those open-ended questions. So just think about the pros and cons to using those open-ended qualitative type questions in those surveys. And then you'll want to think about how to carry out the surveys. Who's going to help distribute them? What resources do you have to distribute the surveys? What partners can you ask to get them out to their constituents? Whether you've got volunteers or interns or things like that that can help you distribute those surveys. And then think about how you're going to tabulate the results. There are really wonderful tools out there now to help do this with the quantitative questions. If you're using Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or things like that, they often have tools that will process that data for you. The qualitative questions, the open-ended questions, are a little bit harder to decipher and to get the gems out of them because they're a little more subjective. But think about how you're going to tabulate those results when you're creating this process, because it might make it easier if you know for sure you only want quantitative information. Then you can make sure that those questions kind of are set up in that way. So those are some of the basic methods for collecting primary sources of data. And then the next steps, 4, 5, and 6, are they're lumped into one slide, but that doesn't mean they're short or easy. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is to organize your key findings. You're going to want to look at, within your key findings, what are the strengths that are coming out? What kind of gaps in services are you seeing? What opportunities might be present within the findings that you're seeing? And what challenges or barriers are emerging from the kind of the program or the intervention you're thinking about implementing? You can organize your findings into themes if that's more helpful. If this kind of SWOT analysis isn't working, what kind of themes are emerging, and you can categorize them in that way. When you start to separate your key findings one from the other and categorize them and put them into themes, you start to be able to use them more effectively and see how they're going to fit into what you're trying to do and the action steps you're going to be taking. They'll start to, these kind of gems will start to bubble up when you start to organize the data, which can be really awesome and a really exciting part of this process. So once you've kind of organized your data and you've got your major themes and you've got it organized into categories and you're starting to think about what does this information mean and how are we going to use this information. So this can be the step where where maybe you want to present the findings at this stage, or maybe you want to hold back and present the findings once you've established an implementation plan. This is kind of up to you how you share your information. But I think sharing your findings is a really important step, especially when you're working with collaborators or stakeholders. They're going to want to know what came out of this assessment. So you can invite the participants, people who participated in your study, to maybe a public presentation of your findings. You can share the information with them. You can send the partners maybe a final copy of a report if that's what you're putting out. Maybe you want to share this report with local government agencies if that's appropriate or helpful. Maybe you want to share it with your organization's membership or the board. Maybe you even want to issue a press release if it's some kind of information that would be appropriate to do that. So think about how you want to present your findings to your stakeholders, and then how are you going to start to establish priorities around these findings. And this is kind of the hard part. It's kind of fun to collect information and to brainstorm and to think about what's possible and what can be done. But the implementation stage is the challenging part. Like how do you put action steps around what you've discovered? And I think this is where a lot of people get bogged down or where things stall out. So make sure as you're going through this process that you always have the implementation phase in the back of your mind so that it doesn't become an impossibility when you get to this step. I'm going to talk through just a couple of kind of problems that often arise in this implementation phase. So maybe it will spark something. You can, when you're in this process, you can avoid some of these pitfalls. Setting priorities around the data that you've collected can be really challenging because it often requires developing consensus among your stakeholders around how this community issue should be addressed, which is really challenging because different stakeholders come to the table with different agendas and different pet projects and different ways they want to do things. So it can be challenging when you're working with a lot of different groups to develop this consensus, but it's not impossible, and especially if people can always go back to that main goal they had when you started to figure out your key questions. When you can go back to that main goal and keep that in mind, it will help you stay on track and not get too torn apart and going in different directions. But some potential barriers that you might encounter when you're at this phase. The first one I like to call the human problem. And this is the challenge of getting people to focus on those key issues and the decisions that need to be made around those issues, and dealing with potential conflicts that surround that. Basically straying from the mission of this assessment and the goals of this assessment. So that can be challenging. Ways to address that are maybe working to set those initial priorities and make them very clear and firm up front. Why are we doing this? What are the stakes? Why is this important? And if you've got those clear up front, you can constantly return back to those if people start to go in different directions. Stress the value in recognizing different viewpoints. Yes, these viewpoints are all very valid. And how can we take those viewpoints and build them back into those initial priorities and make sure we're moving forward and not getting too spread too thin in different directions. So stress the value of those different viewpoints, but always tie it back into those initial priorities. And that helps keep people happy and on board. Also build in time to allow people to reflect on this information together, the process, and modify decisions if necessary. I think sometimes if people feel listened to, if they have time to reflect together and talk about it together, sometimes they can then be okay setting their issue to the side and moving forward with the initial priorities the group has set out. So sometimes just allowing that process to unfold in that way can be really helpful. The next kind of barrier people often include or encounter, I call the process problem. So managing information and ideas during this priority setting process, especially if you're working in groups, people have lots of ideas will pop up and lots of them will not be feasible. So trying to manage this information process, this idea process, and defining clear priorities and working to minimize multiple interpretations of the issue will be really helpful. People might interpret the data or the problem or the solutions very differently. So working to kind of minimize multiple interpretations whenever possible and bring everything back to those initial priorities you established. So being very clear and specific about those priorities can be really helpful. Making the key information available to folks before you meet to talk about it so they can digest and reflect and kind of lose their cool if they need to on their own before they come into a meeting where you're going to actually be talking about action steps. So giving them time to digest the information before meeting together is really helpful. And then be mindful of taking too much time to analyze information. If you want to analyze it to death and go through each thing and talk about all the different scenarios and possibilities, you might fall into this trap of analysis paralysis and not ever get to the implementation stage. So just be mindful, have a start and end time to this the analyzation process, and then move on with the best information that you can. Also be mindful of not rushing through this analysis process. If you just take a glance at the information and think you know what it says and you're moving forward 100 miles an hour, you might miss something or some of the nuances of the assessment piece. So just make sure you're giving it enough time but not spending too much time in that process and not actually getting to the action phases. Another problem you may encounter, I termed the structure problem. So this refers to setting priorities across different issue areas. If you're working with multiple stakeholders, they might have multiple needs and multiple agendas going. So how do you set priorities that maybe go across these different issue areas but are still in line with the initial priorities you've established for this project? So cultivating open communication is going to be really important. Establishing those priorities initially are going to be really important. Coming back to those priorities, why it's important, what are the stakes here, what are we on board to do? Just reminding folks of that initial goal is going to be really important to help people get on board, even if it's a little bit different than their organization's current mission. And then to keep the focus on the current priorities. It's so easy to, once you get talking about these needs and ideas, to kind of go off in different directions. Especially if you think about that little video about gang violence and everything that's connected to it. When you're working with different stakeholders, it can be really easy to get kind of torn in different directions. So really focusing on the current priorities, the project at hand, what are we looking at right now, and keeping people focused in that way can help that structure problem. And then the institutional problem is the challenge of translating these priorities that you've now established into action steps. I think this is one of the most common issues. Especially here on higher ed campuses, we love to talk and doing is a little bit harder. So the doing phase can be put off or can get kind of bogged down in the details of the planning phase. So you want to make sure the planning phase doesn't override the doing phase and that you actually get to the doing phase. So here you can work to build on the strengths you already have in implementation. So if you know you've got really strong program development team, make sure you're taking advantage of that. So think about what strengths you currently have within implementation that you can rely on to make sure that these priorities that you've now identified don't kind of languish in the planning phase. So make sure you're building on your existing strengths with implementation. Make sure you have well-defined implementation plans based on the priorities you've established. You want to make sure you've got who is doing what, by when, how are they going to do it, what resources are going to be available, and have it really lined out with benchmarks along the way, and make sure you're in good communication with the people that are going to be pushing those benchmarks forward so that everybody's on the same page and you can all be held to that same timeline. I've just seen a lot of really awesome plans just get put on the shelf and sit there. So it's so sad to do all that work and to come up with these great ideas and then to not have that really clear, concrete implementation plan put in place. Also make sure that those responsible for carrying out key tasks within this plan, they must be committed to the changes that you're making or to the direction that you're going in. If you're feeling resistance from somebody that's got an important piece of this plan to do, you want to address that before you get into the middle of something and you realize they're not doing what they should be doing because they don't really agree with the direction you're going in. So try to address or identify any of those kind of issues or resistances before you get too deep into it, because it will cause more problems down the road So try to address those issues up front. Make sure that those responsible for carrying out key tasks are committed and on board. And if they're not, what can you do to kind of help them get on board? Great. I kind of went through all those really fast, but I will show you resources on our last slide that go into this in much greater detail. Now I want to give you a chance to talk in your breakout groups about what your assessment needs are, whether they're more like asset focused, you know the issue at hand, now you want to find out the assets that are available, or whether you're still working on identifying the specific needs. So what are your community assessment needs in general? And then I want you to talk in your groups about what assessment methods might work best to meet your needs. And have you had any success with any of these options before? Have you tried any of them, and what has worked well or what hasn't worked well? So in your groups, you'll have about 1 minute per person. You don't have to just speak for 1 minute and then go to the next person, but I just want you to have an idea for how much time you'll have in your groups. So it'll be about 1 minute to talk per person, and talk about your assessment needs, what methods might work best for you and what you've tried in the past, and talk a little bit about how you're going to incorporate that assessment mapping piece that TED Talk kind of addressed. And Callie, are we set to break out?
Yeah, I also just put the questions in the chat box if anyone needs to refer back to them. I sent them in the email yesterday, but I figured I would offer them up in the chat box. I can do the breakout room right now. Just bear with me. It might take me a moment.
And then also, like Kelly mentioned at the beginning, make sure somebody in your group is taking notes, because they'll be our reporter outer once we come back to the large group. So I want to hear a little bit about your conversations.
All right, here we go.
All right, folks are starting to come back. We'll just give a couple more seconds. All right, it looks like I think everybody's back. I'm curious, your note takers, we'll just kind of popcorn out and you'll have to unmute yourself. But I want to hear about your discussions and what kind of methods you think might be most helpful for you to meet your community assessment needs. So if anybody would like to volunteer to go first, hopefully we don't have a flood of people talking over, but we'll just try this. I see Alexis is unmuted. Let's go with you.
Great. So a couple of us are second year Vista, so a lot of the like community assessment building started in the previous year, but then also trying to keep the ball rolling on continually understanding what's going on and where we fit in to help support the general goal and the future goals. Is kind of
wonderful. Did you talk about any specific methods that you might work to help push that ball forward more?
We talked about focus groups and community outreach, and we talked a little bit about one-on-one and some surveys and trying to gather information from the general public to use for our specific projects.
Excellent. You guys hit them all. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that discussion. Who else wants to share?
This is Rachel, and I have Andrew Pryor with me as well. And in our focus group, Andrew mentioned his work at the Gallatin College. Yeah, Gallatin College is really focusing on identifying different backgrounds that incoming students might have that prevent them from attending dual enrollment colleges. And so he said that he's been doing focus groups with nonprofits in the area to ask them to put themselves in the shoes of students from varying backgrounds to see. Oh, is it
wonderful.
Yeah, so just kidding, actual students, to see why they might not pursue higher ed. And then he said the next step is finding out what sort of questions they even should be asking. Like, should they be finding out about parent education levels and income statuses to see if those are contributing factors. And then I mentioned that a big tactic my placement uses is surveys. I'm working at a food pantry, and so right now we're kind of battling the issue of the students we're serving at our food pantry are very diverse, from family graduate students to international students, and so we're trying to find what sort of food we should even be providing in the first place for these students. So most of these surveys are being used at my location.
Wonderful. Wonderful use of surveys. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Who else? Antoinette, are you on mute to talk for your group? No?
It looks like we've only heard from 2 of our groups. So how about breakout room 1 with Lexi and Marlena and Paxton?
I'll talk to them. So 2 of us in our group are very much so not involved in community assessment right now, but another 2 were talking about like roundtables, focus groups, really comprehensive surveys, really focused in getting to know the community personally and just kind of like what community members really want and need here. So just, like creating surveys that really get to the bottom of that question.
Excellent. And thank you for reiterating that point that anything you're working on needs to come from the community itself. They need to express that this is a need. So thank you for mentioning that really important point again. Yeah, anything you're thinking about needs to come from the community. It needs to be a community identified need. Excellent. Did we have one more group, Callie?
Yeah, breakout room number 4. It looks like Danielle and Yannette, and then I'm not quite sure who this person is, but it's a phone number that starts with 860.
What does your group talk about?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think the person on the phone, I don't know. They didn't say anything, so I don't know if they heard us or I don't know where they were. Anyways, Yannette and I were talking. I think she mentioned being interested in either like maybe possibly creating like an incentive for surveys. I think she mentioned that they were doing surveys, but they were just having issues with getting responses, and they lack of money to sort of have an incentive for those surveys. I think for myself, I mean, we're doing surveys and they actually work really well because we require them. And the students they do them, they have to do them. And then we also do like small group focus, like focus groups with students that are usually, a few minutes at a time. We'll ask them, a few specific questions about some aspect of the program or something that we're doing, and get their feedback. I think I'm interested. I wish that I could attend board meetings, and maybe I should talk to my supervisor about that, because I just would be curious to see how those are used. If they're used as focus groups, or really what goes on. I've never attended a board meeting, so I'd be curious. So that's, I guess, one area where I'm curious.
Mm-hmm.
About,
excellent.
So.
Yeah, I'm glad you have a captive audience for your surveys. That's excellent. I think, attending board meetings is a really great idea if you haven't done that, if you're not familiar with what goes on there, because it can be really helpful to understand more of the process and how nonprofits are run to attend those board meetings. Great, thank you. Any questions about the content we've covered that are just burning? I want to make sure I have time to share this next slide with these resources. These two resources are wonderful. If I went too fast, or if you want more detailed information about the steps we talked about, I'm just going to click on them to make sure they still work, and kind of show you. So this website is awesome. It goes through 24 different steps of community assessment in really good detail. So if you're kind of stuck at a phase, or you're you need more information about something, you can just click on one of these. You don't have to go through all 24 of these steps to get the information that you need. If you're just looking at conducting surveys, they've got 2 chapters here on that alone. So this is a really wonderful resource with a lot of great information. It's got a section on focus groups. So anything that you're kind of working on or chewing on, there's some really good information here, a little bit more detail than I was able to provide in our time together on that. And let me find the next. And this next one isn't quite as detailed, but it is also pretty wonderful. So these chapters up here, these tabs up here, go through the different kind of steps that we talked about: the needs and assets, define the scope, whether to collaborate or not, collecting the data, and just a little bit more detail. So the steps to collaborating. So and it's a little less daunting, it's a little less information than the other website. So if you want just less information but a little more than we had, that resource is really wonderful. Great. So I want to share those, and Callie will make those available to you through that PowerPoint. Any final questions, comments, tips, suggestions? Wonderful. Kelly, do you have any reminders for them that you want to pass along before we sign off?
I do. Our next CBI session number 4, will take place on Tuesday, October 16th from 11 to 12 a.m. And the topic is strategic planning and implementation with Rock Turner. So make sure that you tune in for that. And just like all the other sessions that we've done so far, look for an email from me this afternoon with the resources, the recording of this session, and a short evaluation. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.